Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. This is Jay from Coding with Jaybird, where I upload weekly tutorials to help build your confidence in coding. Today we're going to learn a little bit about JavaScript timers. Let's get started, shall we? I've made a timers folder here. You can see I have a timing events.html file. Now I also have a style sheet for my CSS, and that's in my CSS folder. I also have an image folder with a few images and a main.js that we're going to be coding in today. All right, so let's have a look at our main.js. I'd like to introduce you to a few timing methods. The first one is called the Set Interval method. Now this method calls a function at specified intervals, which is in milliseconds. So it continues to call the function over and over again until another method called clear interval is called, or the window is closed, whichever comes first. All right, so let's go ahead and start with our first method called the set interval method. And like I said, intervals repeat the function that's defined within it every number of milliseconds that you've defined. So I'm going to have some variable called myTimer, and this myTimer is going to equal the window object dot the set interval method. Now, I don't need to use this window. I could completely omit this if I want and just simply type set interval method. But just for the first example, I wanted to demonstrate that you should, or not should, but could use the window itself. All right, so in here, there's two ways to write this. You can have like an unnamed function here, so you can just have some function. And then as a second argument, you pass in the number of milliseconds at which you want this function to repeat itself. So I'm going to say 1,000 milliseconds, which is the same as 1 second. Okay, so whatever function I have defined here will run for every 1 second. So what do I want to do in here? Well, let's create a simple console.log message that's just going to say 1 second. And I just want to do this so that I can demonstrate how this works. So when I save it, we'll see on the right, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3, so on. It just keeps going up and up. So this is telling us that it is in fact working, and it's a repeating interval where every 1 second this function is doing something. Okay, now let's create a function that will change this text for us. So if we go back into our HTML file, I have this H3, so you can't really see it, but it's under this timing events. At this point, I have nothing in there. What I want to do is I want to change the text in there. So let's go ahead and create a function that'll do that. So I'll say let timer text equal document.get element, element by ID. And here I'll say timer, since that's the ID of that H3. And then what I want to do is I'm going to say set interval. And here I want some function to run. So let's say I'm going to create a function called start timer. And I want this function to run every 3 seconds, so every 3,000 milliseconds. Now we haven't created this yet, so I'm going to go up here and actually create this function next. So function start timer. And then this function is going to do something. Now note, I do not have round brackets after this because I don't want to automatically run this function. So I want it to wait for the 3 seconds. So I'm referencing this function, but the set interval is going to call it after the 3 second delay. Okay, so in this function, let's reference this timer text variable that we've created up here and say that timer text inner HTML should change to, let's say times up. And then let's put a dash and a space. Now, what I'm thinking of doing is actually concatenating to whatever's already there. So I can do a plus equals, and that basically means whatever happens to already be in that H3 tag should remain, and then we just join this to the end of it. Okay, so I'm going to do that, and also let's change the color of it because right now it'll just be black. So we'll say timer text dot, no, not inner HTML, style dot color equals, and I'm just going to use a number that I've already written down. So the hex code FB6955. And now when I save this, let's see it do its magic. 3 seconds, and you can see at the 3-second mark, this time's up showed up. And then 6 seconds it happened again. Now at 9 it happened again, and so on. So every 3 seconds it's joining this times up onto that H3. All right, looks good. Now I can also stop this counting effect that we see here, this 28 seconds, 30, and the fact that it's doing this 1 second over and over again. So basically this my timer, I can actually clear that with a new method called the clear interval method. Okay, so I'm going to let that happen based on this button click. So I'm going to say let reset. So we'll have this reset variable equal, or rather reference, this reset button, which has an ID of reset-btn. So again, we'll say document.get element by ID, and we'll reference that button, reset-btn, and then we'll attach an onClick event onto that. So reset.onClick equals, we could also use an event listener, but I'm just going to keep it simple and use the onClick. And it'll just be an anonymous function. And in here, we're going to use this new clear interval method, inside which we pass in whatever the original timer was. So the original timer was called my timer. So here I can pass in my timer. So let's reload the page on the right. So at 3 seconds, we can see time's up occurred, and at 6, it'll happen again. There we go. Now, this timer will stop going up when I click this button. So I'll say click, reset interval timer, and you notice this stopped at 14. Now, this time's up is still going to keep occurring because that's something completely independent of my timer. So that has to do with line 15, where we have the start timer function happening. So this will keep doing its magic, but then we've stopped this console.log with the clear interval. All right, great. Okay, so I'm just reloading the page again, and let's continue with our next method that I want to talk about, which is called the Set Timeout Method. Now, the Set Timeout Method is very similar, however, it only runs once. So it runs only the one time and after the specified number of milliseconds. Okay, so let's reference this clock. So I've got this image here, and you can see this image has an ID of clock. So the idea is it's a plain beige canvas right now, and I'm going to replace this with the image of a clock. So let's say let clock equal document.get element by ID, and in here we want to reference clock, which I just showed you in the HTML file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function called show clock, and this function is just going to change the source of the image. So I'm going to reference that clock ID, or rather the clock variable that we just created here, and then I'll change its source attribute by saying clock.src equals, and here we just pass in a string and change to a new location. So right now it's pointing to empty.jpg. Let's point to this clock.jpg. Okay, so here I'll say img/clock.jpg. Oops, JPEG. Okay, and of course that's not going to do anything for us right away. We actually have to put a timeout on it. So let's say let some show clock timer equals, so I'm just creating a variable and I'm going to store this set timeout function, timeout function inside of it. Now this set timeout function, we could write an anonymous function inside of it, or we can pass in a function that we've already named. So I'm just going to pass in show clock and comma. So the second argument will be how many milliseconds it must wait till this actually occurs. So I'm going to say 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. And when I save this, so this page reloads on the right, let's see what happens. At the 5-second mark, we see this clock is going to change, and it has. It changed from the blank canvas or empty canvas to this nice clock image. So once again, let's reload the page and test it out. Now watch what happens at the 5-second mark. There we go, the clock changed. Okay, now everything else is still doing what it should be doing. And we can still test this reset interval timer, and we've stopped it at the 12-second mark. Okay, great. Now what if, for some reason, I'm coming up with an application that has the ability to stop the set timeout? What if I needed that to happen? Well, there's something called a clear timeout. So let's demonstrate that next. So I'll say let hide clock btn equal, and I'm going to reference this hide clock blue button here. So if we look in here in our HTML, it's called hide clock -btn. So once again, I'll use my document.get element by ID to reference that. And it's hide clock -btn. Okay, and what I want to do is add an event listener to it, or an on-click event to it. So I'll say hide clock btn dot on click equals some anonymous function. And in this anonymous function, I'm going to pass in this new method called clear timeout. And in the clear timeout method, I need to pass in an argument. Now, what's the argument I should pass in? Well, I need to pass in what I'm trying to clear. So if my set timeout is stored in this variable called show clock timer, I can pass in show clock timer in here. So let's save this, and this will reload on the right. And if I hit this button first, just before the 5-second mark, notice that this image never changed. Okay, so let's practice that again. This time at maybe the 3-second mark, I've clicked the hide clock button, and you can see the clock never displayed. And if I reload it and don't click any buttons, then at the 5-second mark, the clock should show up, and it does. Okay, perfect. All right, everyone, that's it for today's tutorial on JavaScript timers. If you've enjoyed my video and learned something new, please like and subscribe to my channel. Until next week, keep on coding.